Today, we're going to look at 3 stories about 3 normal people who at some point made decisions that at the time didn't really seem like that big of a deal, but those decisions quickly changed their lives forever and affected the lives of millions and millions of other people. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and dump out their Mountain Dew and replace it with pickle juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in 2009, a 38-year-old man was sitting inside of a manga cafe in Seoul, South Korea. So a manga cafe is a lot like a normal cafe. You can go inside and buy snacks or drinks and socialize, do whatever. But also in manga cafes like this one, they have these big in-store libraries that contain manga. And manga are like comic books. Now, this man did not have a lot of money. And so when he went inside of this cafe, he didn't buy any drinks or food. He just went up to the in-store library, grabbed an edition of his favorite manga series, and just sat down and began to read. Now, this man had read this particular series multiple times. He just kept coming back to it because he thought it was like the best manga you could possibly read. Now, a lot of people actually didn't know what to make of this particular series. It was actually kind of controversial because it was so over-the-top violent, like well beyond any other series. But to this man, that sort of made it stand out. It made it sort of special, and he loved it. In fact, it was so crazy, this series, that every time he read it, it allowed him to sort of leave his life for a second and just totally escape into this wild, violent story. And right now, in this man's life, he really needed that escape because his real life was pretty terrible. He had spent practically his whole life studying and working to try to become a professional writer and director. But in Seoul, the entertainment industry was pretty unpredictable. And so this man had successfully landed a couple of jobs here and there, doing some writing and, doing some directing, but they were small gigs and they typically fizzled out at some point. And so over and over again, like right now in this man's life, he found himself back in the same position he always was in, which was unemployed. At the moment, this man lived with his mother and his grandmother. But even though all 3 of them were pooling their resources, they still struggled to just pay for rent. In fact, recently, the man had to sell his laptop, the thing he used for all of his writing. It was like how he was going to eventually crack a career in entertainment for real. He had to sell that just so that they wouldn't get evicted. And if that wasn't bad enough, the man had also begun taking out all these short-term loans with high interest rates just to pay for basic needs. Forget rent, like just food and basic necessities he was taking out loans for, but he had no way to pay them back. And so the debt was just piling up nonstop. And so for this man, the stress was like unbearable. And the only way he could find to even begin to cope with it was to escape into his manga books. And even though he knew that didn't solve his problems, he didn't care. It was like, life is so bad, at least briefly, I can read manga and escape. And so that's what he was doing today. And so he took his favorite manga booth, he sat back inside of the booth and just allowed himself to get sucked into the story for the 20th time. He's read this thing multiple times. And so as he was reading this manga book, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, this man all the time came up with various story ideas that maybe he could write and would be the next big thing for him. But for some reason, it was like, wait a minute. What if I write a story that's sort of, loosely based or at least inspired by my favorite piece of writing, this manga series? Like, wait a minute, I think I have a really good idea that sort of transcends any other idea I've ever had. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized there were other elements of his life that he could sort of attach to this story that's sort of beginning with this concept that came from this manga series. And so before long, he had put the manga book aside, got a pen and some paper, and just began writing down some ideas, general ideas for this new story he was going to try to write. And for hours and hours, he sat in the booth just writing like crazy. And by the time the cafe was closing, he had this amazing outline of a whole world, this whole story he was going to write. And he just knew this was the one. This was the thing that was going to break him out of poverty and officially make him a successful writer. Several months later, This man had transformed that amazing outline into a fully realized project, and then he went out to try to sell it. And he's thinking, everybody's gonna want this thing. This is like an iconic, unique piece of IP. People are gonna be clamoring to buy this. But what he found very quickly is every buyer he went to hated it. They told him, this is simply too weird and way too violent. Like, this is well beyond what's reasonable. This is not something anybody's gonna want. Like, you will not have an audience for this. And the man was sort of crushed, because to him it was so clear, this is an amazing idea. This story is so good. People that have experienced real poverty, who understand the lengths that people will go to make money when they are desperate, they'll relate to this. Like, there's a huge audience for this. But the buyers, they didn't see it that way. And so for the next 10 years, this guy kept trying to sell this story. I mean, he really genuinely believed in it, and he figured someone's gonna take a chance on this. They have to. It's too good. But for 10 years, everybody just kept saying, no, it's not good enough. No one wants this. But then, sort of out of left field, 10 years later, a major production studio actually said, you know what? This looks pretty good. We will buy it. This man's story was converted into a TV show, and it premiered in 2021, 12 years after the man originally conceptualized of the story inside of that manga cafe. And when this TV show aired, it was basically a global phenomenon overnight. It became the most talked about show anywhere in every corner of the internet pretty much immediately. It also made the production company that bought this story $900 million. And the man who actually wrote the story, he also got paid very well, and he won an Emmy. The manga series that this man read that sort of inspired all of this to happen was called Battle Royale. And in this series, these students are forced to fight to the death by a fascist government. And so what this man did is he combined that concept, fighting to the death, with something that he himself was dealing with in his own life, which was poverty. And he knew firsthand, the lengths he was willing to go just to make a little bit of money to make ends meet. And he knew other people who, were dealing with poverty were also sort of desperate. And they would go to great lengths just to make ends meet. And he said, okay, let's marry those two concepts. Poor people who were fighting to the death for money. The writer's name was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and the name of this TV series was Squid Game. As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballen Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has two shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious wartime stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified, and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then two other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large. And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff and you really want stories that are really rooted in the fabric of our timeline, I mean, stories that are truly historically accurate, but still strange, dark, and mysterious and crazy, well, check out A Twist of History, hosted by Joel. He's great voice. He's a very thorough host. Those stories all have really cool endings, big plot twists at the end. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy. One day in the summer of 1953, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was cleaning up his recording studio, which was located in a fast-growing city known for their vibrant music scene. Sam had just finished recording a church choir, and now he was getting ready for his next client. And so he was resetting all the equipment and cleaning up. But Sam didn't actually know who his next client would be or when they'd show up. Because Sam's recording studio was pretty unique. Because he was always on the hunt for new talent to sign, he had opened up his studio to anybody who wanted to come in at any time. All they had to do was show up, give him $4, and they could be recorded professionally. This did mean that a lot of times his clients were not very talented, but he felt like it gave him the biggest opportunity to cast the widest net to potentially find his next big star. So that day, Sam finished cleaning up the studio and resetting everything, and then Sam just sat down and waited, hoping that, another client would come through the door. And eventually, another client did. This young kid, he was 18 years old, he came strolling inside, he had a guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was pretty shy. And the guy came up to him and he just said, "Hey, I work as a truck driver, but I love to sing, I love to play the guitar as a hobby, and I just wanted to come in here and, record a couple of ballads for my mom." And so Sam, again, he took all kinds. He's like, "Absolutely, give me $4 and we can record these ballads." And so the kid handed over $4 and he went into the booth, and Sam's like, "All right, you're on." And Sam basically expected this kid to do what most other clients of his did, which was, they'd begin playing and be sort of like not that good at their instrument, and they'd sing off key, and, Sam just kind of sitting there listening to this terrible music, just waiting for it to end. But with this kid, it was different. Once he began strumming his guitar and singing, it was like he totally broke out of his shell. I mean, he was, at first glance, a very shy, sort of reserved guy, but in the booth, he was electric. He was amazing. And so Sam sat there listening to this kid record his ballads and was just so blown away by how talented he was. And then when it was all done, the kid said thank you. He took his recordings with him and he left. And then once he was gone, Sam just made a point to make a note about this kid that just said, "Good ballad singer, save." Basically, remember this guy because I think he's going to be something special. About a year later, in 1954, Sam was back in his recording studio and he was working with another client. It was this band and they were trying to record some songs. But as they were playing, they decided that they were really lacking another vocalist to round out the sound. And so they asked Sam, like, "Hey, do you know anybody?" Sam's studio manager, who was in the room and overheard the request, immediately chimed in and said, "Hey, Sam, what about that 18-year-old ballad singer from last year? He was great. Maybe he could be the vocalist." And so Sam was like, "Yeah, I'll give him a call." So he called this young man and he was like, "Yeah, I'll jump in there and record some vocals. That'd be great." So the young kid, the truck driving, beautiful ballad singing kid, came back to the studio. He hopped in the booth with this band and they began playing together, and they sounded terrible. Now, the young man was still very much a great singer. Like, Sam could clearly hear his voice cutting through all the noise, but it was like the kid and the band had no chemistry. I mean, they just met each other, so it's not that surprising. And the music that the band was trying to play just didn't really line up well with this kid's vocals, and so it just wasn't working. And so Sam clearly could see that. He couldn't really tell if the band or this kid could see that, and so he said, "Hey guys, for right now, just take a quick break." And so Sam ended the recording, and the band and the kid, they left to go get a drink, and Sam left the booth and went into the control room, which is basically right next door, but does not have a line of sight into the booth. And he was just in there to sort of collect his thoughts and just kind of reset for a second. But then at some point, he hears the sound of music being played back in the booth where he'd just come from. Except the music was different. It was really upbeat, it was fast, it was loud, and Sam could clearly hear the sound of that kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer. He was just going to town, like he was singing at the top of his lungs, and it just really sounded like something was going on in there. And so Sam left the control room, ran into the booth, and he goes in there, and when he got in there, he saw the band and this kid just totally rocking out. It was like they suddenly had amazing chemistry. The kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer is jumping all over the booth. I mean, he's totally into the song. And the band very clearly was sort of following the kid's lead. They were basically playing music to match the kid's energy. And Sam is watching this and listening to this, and he's thinking, I have never heard music sound like this before. Like, this is a new type of music that I'm witnessing. I mean, it gave him goosebumps. He couldn't believe it. Like, this is a brand new thing. The sound was sort of a cross between blues and rock and roll. It was a little bit too fast for blues and too slow for rock and roll, but it was something really unique. And all Sam could think as he's watching this happen and as he's listening to this is the kid, the truck driver, the ballad singer. He's the star. It's so obvious. Like, this is coming into being because of him. That's the person I've been looking for. That's the star that I've been trying to sign ever since I started this recording studio. And so that very night, Sam and this band helped the kid record his first ever single, which was called That's All Right. And once that song hit the airwaves, that kid did become a star, practically overnight. He catapulted into music fame that few ever achieve. He literally would become one of the most famous musicians to have ever lived. Sam's studio was called Sun Records, and it was located in Memphis, Tennessee. And the young kid, the truck driver who sang amazing ballads, was none other than Elvis Presley. On the evening of March 31st, 2012, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a boxing ring inside of a convention center in Ottawa, Canada. He could hear the screams of hundreds of fans in the stands all around him, and he knew thousands more were watching him on TV. And Justin was pretty nervous, because this was not only the most important boxing match of his whole career, but it was also his very first boxing match of his career. His reputation and his future were riding on the outcome of this match, and Justin knew he was massively the underdog. Justin looked across the ring at the other corner, and he locked eyes just for a second with his opponent, whose name was Brass Knuckles Brazeau. He had served in the Canadian military, he had a black belt in karate, and he was notorious for packing an insanely strong punch, hence the name Brass Knuckles Brazeau. And pretty much everybody who had been following this fight up to this point didn't just think, oh, Brass Knuckles is gonna beat Justin. No, the thought was Brass Knuckles is going to destroy Justin. And not just because Brass Knuckles has a reputation for a strong punch, but because Justin had a reputation for being totally soft and pampered and just not somebody at all that was viewed as being tough. I mean, the idea that he was even in the ring at all, about to, fight anyone, was a huge shock. I mean, Justin didn't seem like the type who could win any fight, let alone against this guy. And in fact, as soon as Justin had even entered the ring, the announcers, who were trying a little bit to stay neutral, couldn't help but begin making fun of Justin. They even quickly nicknamed him the Shiny Pony as soon as he came into the ring. Like, they couldn't even stop themselves from being like, who is this guy? Like, he's going up against Brass Knuckles. Like, there's no way he wins. But what nobody knew was that Shiny Pony had actually been training really hard for this match for months and months. And he felt like, despite what people thought of him, given the fact that he's nicknamed Shiny Pony here, despite his reputation, he felt inside like he was just as tough as Brass Knuckles, and he did stand a chance here. So when the bell rang for the first round, Shiny Pony got up and he charged across the ring and immediately just started swinging at Brass Knuckles. And none of them landed. Brass Knuckles avoided every punch and just managed to counter and destroy Justin pretty much immediately. I mean, he was pummeling the crap out of Shiny Pony, and the announcers are like, oh my God, he's getting mauled. But they knew it was coming. They were kind of laughing as they were saying it. And like Justin, he knows he's getting destroyed. He's not even trying to throw punches at this point. He's just trying to stay on his feet. And at some point, Brass Knuckles really squared him up and hit him right in the jaw with one of his famous right hooks. And Justin's like about to fall over, and right at that moment, the bell rings again, the round ends, and somehow, Shiny Pony's still on his feet, but barely. But he survived the round. And so Shiny Pony kind of stumbles his way back over to his corner, and Brass Knuckles very calmly and casually walks to his, barely affected by that round. And so for the next several seconds that the two men were sitting in their corners, Brass Knuckles is basically just relaxing until the next round starts. But over in Shiny Pony's corner, like, the medic is working on his face because he's bleeding everywhere, and Justin's coach is telling him, oh, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. But for Justin, it was like he had gotten so smashed during this round he could barely even think. But despite all the noise and the chaos, all he could think in his head was, I can't give up. They think I'm that guy that's gonna get pummeled and beat, and no one's gonna ever let me live this down. I have to go into this next round with reckless abandon. I have to find a way to just stay in the fight. I have to go all in. And so the bell rang again, and Justin, the shiny pony, gets up, and again, he goes across the ring over to Brass Knuckles, except this time, when he starts throwing punches, they land. And surprisingly, it was like every single punch he threw, it was rocking back Brass Knuckles. He was taking hit after hit, and Justin knew, like, this is working. And Justin, like, he can't believe it, but he's just riding it out, like hitting him as hard as he can over and over. And the announcers, they don't even know what to make of it. Like, the shiny pony is coming out here, being the rumble pony here, just destroying Brass Knuckles. And so when the bell finally rang after round 2, it was Brass Knuckles who was barely on his feet, stumbling back to his corner. And it was Shiny Pony, who was, winded, but totally fine. And he went back to his corner, and it was like everybody was in shock. Like, wait a minute, now it's 1-1? Like, this guy's supposed to be a coward, a weakling. Like, how did he do that? And so this time, in the few seconds between rounds 2 and 3, Shiny Pony is in his corner, and he's looking across the ring, and he's staring at Brass Knuckles. And Brass Knuckles was kind of like averting his gaze. He looked totally gassed. He looked scared. Like he couldn't believe he was potentially about to lose to the Shiny Pony. And for Justin the Shiny Pony, that was all the motivation he needed. He knew mentally he had an edge in his opponent. And so when that bell rang for the 3rd round, Justin got up and he went over there to Brass Knuckles and just pummeled him. Just over and over, blasting him in the face. And eventually he struck Brass Knuckles in the nose hard enough that his nose kind of exploded and began bleeding everywhere. And the ref actually had to step in and separate them. And even though, both men actually were down to keep on fighting, the ref said, nope, this is too much. And he ended the fight. It was a technical knockout, and Shiny Pony had won. Now, as much as this victory was huge for Justin, the truth was, Justin was not trying to become a professional boxer or really be in the boxing world in any capacity. This was actually just a charity match. And, Brass Knuckles Brazeau also was not a professional boxer. These two had just simply come together to have this match in order to raise money for charity. But Justin had another goal. He knew that his reputation in Canada was of being this sort of soft, pampered, weak guy. And he thought, if I can just get in the ring with a really formidable opponent in Brass Knuckles Brazeau and hold my own and maybe even beat Brass Knuckles in this fight, even though it's for charity, if I can do that, that could potentially sway the public's opinion about me. He was hoping that this fight could basically transform his image and people would see him as, tough and a serious leader. And that is exactly what happened. After this fight, when he won the fight out of left field, nobody could believe it. It was like he was the talk of Canada for a little while there. They're like, oh, look, Justin the Shiny Pony is actually, a little more serious than we thought he was. He's a pretty tough guy. And so Justin would use that momentum from the fight to eventually land the one thing he wanted more than anything else. He would get elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. The Shiny Pony's full name was Justin Trudeau. Now, I know what you've all been wondering. Where the heck is Seagull Lung? And what's he up to this summer? Well, let me tell you. He has been very busy. He recently graduated from pilot school, and apparently he was so good that he not only graduated at the top of his class, but upon graduation, he was immediately asked to come back and be one of their top instructors. And so naturally, Lungy and all his swagger and coolness agreed. And immediately he became the best flight instructor in the world. And so naturally, given how closely Lungy's incredible trajectory mirrors a classic 1980s Hollywood blockbuster film, the one, we decided to officially make Lungy the commander of our 4th of July summer blockbuster collection. And since Lungy has always been my wingman, I decided this time he should have the limelight and I will be his wingman. But in all seriousness, we do have a brand new summer blockbuster collection that's coming out that has our new t-shirts, okay, right here, the one I was just wearing, and this one, it's recognizing one of my favorite movies, the one, celebrating the 4th of July. We also have this nifty bucket hat. We have koozies, okay? Probably gonna get sued. I think there's a pretty good chance we get sued, and so don't know how long this stuff's gonna be online. But right now it is. And if you go to shopmrballen.com, you can get your amazing summer blockbuster MrBallen merch, okay? Again, shopmrballen.com. Probably getting sued, probably getting taken down, so get on there as soon as you can, okay? Also, you might think that's the whole announcement, but it's not. I got something else for you. I'm gonna do a giveaway. I'm actually gonna be giving away this particular hat. Okay, I'm gonna sign it right here on camera. And so all you have to do is sign up for the Wondery newsletter, and you might be the lucky fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious who gets this classic signed Lungy bucket hat. So all you have to do is click the link in the description below for the Wondery. I'm adding a little smiley face there, okay, so you know it's legitimate. Go to the Wondery newsletter website. The link is in the description below for your chance to win this sweet piece of history, okay? Go get it done. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're gonna look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and slightly unscrew all of their light bulbs so they don't turn on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2005, a 33-year-old pastor named Kyle Lake stood on a stage inside of the University Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. Kyle had just finished delivering that morning's sermon to his congregation, which included about 800 people. And now he was about to welcome a new member, a young woman. So Kyle had been the pastor of this church for the last 7 years. And over that time, the church had really grown and evolved, really directly because of Kyle's leadership. He was known as being a very thoughtful and educated pastor, who was also known to be quite fun and progressive. He often would play pranks on the congregation and keep things really light, even if he was in the middle of a very important sermon. And people liked that. It made him relatable. And so because of Kyle's youthful energy that he clearly gave off, he had sort of gradually shifted the congregation to being a much more young crowd. Predominantly the folks who attended the church were college kids, or roughly that age. And also his wife was an attendee at the church, as were his 3 little kids, who at the moment, as he was up on stage, they were across the hall attending kids' Bible study. Now for Kyle, welcoming a new member into this church had become a very big deal for him. He in fact had this special ceremony he would perform for each and every new member. And really the whole congregation got behind this ceremony. And so today, Kyle was about to do this ceremony with this new member, this young woman. And so Kyle, in front of the whole congregation, he calls this woman up, come on up, we're gonna do the ceremony to welcome you to the church. And so the woman, she gets up and she walks up to the front of the stage and she smiles, and Kyle says hello to her and sort of introduces himself, and the whole church is listening. And then Kyle, as part of this ritual, moved to the very center of the stage, where the actual ceremony was going to take place. And he was about to call the woman up to join him in the center of the stage when there was a malfunction. Now, the malfunction itself was not really a huge deal. All it did was just stop Kyle for a second, and he had to stop talking to the new member, and he had to figure out what he was gonna do, but quickly he saw a fix that didn't even require him to leave the stage. However, the instant he actually made the fix, when he fixed the malfunction, as he was about to start talking to the whole audience again, he just began to scream. Now, at first, nobody took this seriously because their pastor was known for playing pranks on the congregation. And so everybody just thought it was a prank, albeit a strange one. I mean, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, but everyone's sort of looking around like, this is a prank, right? But then Kyle's screams began to include words. He began screaming, "Help! Help me!" And at that point, it sort of clicked for the whole congregation that this was not a joke. Something was terribly wrong. Even though they're looking up at him and nothing appeared to be wrong. Nothing made sense. And so immediately it was like the church spiraled into chaos and confusion. People are bowing their heads, praying as fiercely as they could, praying for his safety. Others are sprinting out of the church, not even knowing what to do. And still more were calling 911, like several people calling 911. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, it was like people still had no idea what actually was happening. In fact, honestly, the paramedics didn't. It was like, what is this? But within a few days, they were able to figure out what happened. And it surprised everyone. So the special ceremony that Kyle would perform for every new member was a baptism. And so when Kyle moved to the very center of the stage, and he actually called up the woman to join him in the center of the stage, he actually was stepping into the baptismal pool. Picture like a hot tub, waist-high water, it's warm water. And so Kyle literally stepped into the hot tub and he's calling up this woman to join him in the pool so she can be baptized. However, before this woman actually got to the pool, Kyle has this malfunction. And all it was is his lapel mic shut off. It wasn't working anymore. And because the church he was in was huge and cavernous, sound really didn't travel well. He needed a microphone to project his voice. And so he had to stop the ceremony for a second and find another microphone. Luckily, there was a stand with a microphone in it right within arm's reach. And so Kyle grabbed it. However, what Kyle didn't know was there actually was a second malfunction that had happened either at this instant or just before, but either way, there was another malfunction that he had no idea about. And that was that the heaters of the baptismal pool that kept the water warm were damaged. And as a result of this damage, the water in that pool had become electrically charged. And so the instant Kyle grabbed that microphone, he grounded the electricity in the pool. Basically, he created a pathway for the electricity to travel through his body. When he began to scream, that was him being electrocuted. Despite the efforts of first responders and the medical staff at the hospital, Kyle unfortunately did not survive. As for Kyle's wife, who literally watched this happen from the front row of the church, she watched her husband be killed. She ultimately sued the electrical company that installed those heaters in the baptismal pool, and she would settle for an undisclosed amount of money. Dive into a world of endless imagination with Audible. Whether you like to listen to stories, seek motivation, or just need expert advice, you can be inspired to imagine new worlds, new possibilities, and a new way of thinking. Audible offers over 1 million audiobooks, as well as podcasts and Audible originals, all in one easy-to-use app. You can easily explore bestsellers, new releases, and thousands of podcasts and audiobooks that you can listen to all you want, with new ones added every day. Audible effortlessly weaves inspiration and entertainment into your daily routine. You can easily find the genres you love and discover new ones you like along the way. A title I cannot recommend enough is called The Road by Cormac McCarthy. It's about a father and son as they travel to safety after most of the world has been destroyed in this apocalyptic event. It's an incredible story of survival and hope. It's an amazing narrative. You gotta check it out. With Audible, there are endless audiobooks to choose from to fuel your imagination. There's more to imagine when you listen. Sign up for a free 30-day Audible trial and get your first audiobook for free. Just go to audible.com/MrBallen. Again, that's audible.com/MrBallen for a free 30-day trial. Okay, back to the stories. Around 5 p.m. on Sunday, August 15th, 1971, a 23-year-old man named Michael was sitting inside of his living room in rural Ontario, Canada. Michael was flipping through a photo album that showed pictures of him scuba diving and mountain biking and doing all these really high adrenaline activities because Michael really lived for adventure. And so as he's flipping through this album, he hears a knock on the door. So he stops what he's doing, he goes to the door, he opens it up, and there's this police officer who's totally frantic and is speaking a mile a minute, and he tells Michael, hey, so we had this guy who was swimming in a lake nearby, and he went missing. He's been gone for over an hour now. We don't know where he is, and we were asking around, does anybody have any scuba diving equipment or experience, because we need to get in there and look for this guy in the lake. And everybody said, you're the guy. You have scuba equipment, and maybe you might be able to lend it to us so that, the police could go in there and look for this guy. Now, Michael was kind of caught off guard by all this. I mean, this was not a typical occurrence to have police show up and have this type of request, but Michael immediately felt this sense of responsibility. He did know that he was sort of the top dog in scuba diving in rural Ontario, Canada, and he's hearing this police officer say what he's saying, but he's thinking, even if I give you my equipment, you can't just put the stuff on and safely conduct dives. You need the training as much as you need the equipment. And so Michael just kind of instinctively said, hey, look, I'm not just gonna give you the equipment because I feel like I'm setting you up for failure here. What if I come with you, I'll put the equipment on, and I'll go look for this guy. I know what I'm doing, I know how to use the equipment, it'll be way safer and more efficient. And the cop said, thank you so much, that would be great, let's go. And so Kyle, he went and got his scuba equipment, and before long, he had thrown it in the police cruiser, and the two of them were flying towards the lake. About 30 minutes later, Michael and the police officer pull into this parking lot, this wooded lot with trees everywhere, and straight ahead of them, through the trees, they can see down below is this big lake. And then to the left of the lake is a big dam, and then beyond that, over to the left side of that, is a river. And so where the swimmer had gone missing was in the lake portion. And so Michael quickly hopped out of the car, he grabbed his scuba gear, and then he and the officer took off running through the trees down to the lake. And when they got down there, Michael scanned the area and he saw there were all these police officers and park employees. There were other people who clearly had just come to the lake that day, like tourists, and everybody's kind of scanning the lake. No one's really in the water, but everyone's sort of walking around the perimeters, like hoping they can just see this missing swimmer somewhere. And also Michael noticed clearly the family of this missing man was, off to the side, and many of them were crying. But it definitely seemed like no serious search effort had really happened yet. It's like everybody was just kind of waiting for something to happen. And so when Michael shows up with all his scuba gear, it was like everybody looked at him as like, oh my goodness, thank you. Like, get in there, find him. Like, I bet he's okay. Like, get out there. And Michael, he's thinking to himself that he hadn't done a search like this before, but the fact somebody was missing for that long already did not bode well. But he thought, you know what? I'm gonna go in there, I'm gonna give it my best shot, and I hope we find this guy still alive. And so Michael put on all his equipment right on the shore side, and everyone's waiting, kind of watching, anxious about what's gonna happen next. And once he had donned his equipment, Michael stood up and just began scanning the lake, looking for, any sign of where to begin the search, because it's just one man in this huge body of water. He needs sort of a starting point. And so it's quiet, everyone's just kind of watching Michael as Michael's looking around the lake. And then at some point, he looked out and he saw there was this little ripple, sort of right in the middle of the lake. Now, the surface of the lake had basically been glass-like because nobody was really in the water, save for like the very perimeter of the lake. And so the water was very calm, but he sees there's this little ripple sort of right in the middle. And so Michael points out the ripple to the other officer he was with and sort of anybody who could listen. And he said, okay, I'm gonna go in there and start searching right there. And so Michael goes into the water, kind of wades in till about his waist, and then he kind of looked around one more time, put on his mask, and went under the water. About 15 minutes later, the police officer who had originally gone and gotten Michael and driven with him to the lake, he was still just standing on the lake shore, along with the missing swimmer's family and other searchers, and pretty much everybody was just kind of waiting for Michael to give some sort of report about how the search was going. Now, Michael easily had enough air in his tanks to be out there for quite some time to do a pretty thorough search, and they're only 15 minutes in, so they don't really know if this is too early to expect feedback from Michael, but it's just tense. Everybody's just waiting, waiting to see what's gonna happen. But at some point, as this officer is just standing there, one of the volunteer searchers comes bombing along the shore from up near the dam. They ran right down to this officer and said, hey, you gotta come with me. We found something over there in the river. And so, at this point, the police officer is thinking, I bet they found the missing swimmer. They're probably not in this lake. Maybe they found them over in the river. And he's thinking the worst, right? So he runs with the searcher, he goes to the dam, he goes to the riverside on the other side of the dam, and there's this crowd of searchers and police that are all along the shore of the river. And so this police officer, he pushes through the crowd, expecting, frankly, at this point, to see a dead body, to see the missing swimmer. But when he parts the crowd and sees what they're all looking at, he realizes there has been a terrible mistake. So 2 hours earlier, when this missing swimmer first went missing, this is like before Michael was ever contacted, before he was out there searching for him. This is like the initial wave of panic that we have a person who is missing somewhere in this water. Well, a park employee had been really motivated to try to help with the search. And so without really telling anybody, they ran into the control room of the dam, and in there, they turned a valve. And this particular valve opened up a pipe that spanned from the lake back through to the river. And when this valve was turned and the pipe was opened up, water from the lake would go back into the river, basically draining the lake. This employee was thinking, if I drain the lake, it'll make it easier to search the lake where we believe this man has gone missing. Like, this will make it easier to search the lake. And so this pipe has been opened up, this 2-foot in diameter, 30-foot long pipe connecting river and lake. And it's sucking water like mad from the lake into that river. Nobody had really gone into the lake to look for this missing swimmer, believe it or not. So the lake really hadn't been touched as soon as this valve was turned. So the first person who went into the lake, once that was opened up, was Michael with the scuba gear on. And when he went into the water and actually flagged the ripple on the surface of the water, he didn't realize this, but that ripple represented this deadly undercurrent of all the water being sucked into this pipe. And so as soon as he went out and went under the water, the current pulled him so quickly and so hard that he couldn't resurface. All his equipment got yanked off his body and he was thrust into this pipe. And in the pipe, he got stuck. And he drowned inside of the pipe before eventually being forced out the other end where his body spilled out onto the shore of the river. That's what everybody was crowded around once they got up to the riverside, Michael's dead body. 4 hours after Michael's body was found, they would find the missing swimmer. His body was located about 150 yards away from where Michael had first entered the lake. His body was found on the shore of the lake, and so Michael had sort of been close, but unfortunately that current had pulled him under and killed him. Today, the lake has been permanently drained, in part because of this tragedy. At 5 a.m. on June 28, 1988, a 25-year-old man named Jeffrey Link stood in the supply room of a small factory in Auburn, Indiana. He reached up and he grabbed a container on the shelf, and then with it in hand, he turned, left the supply room, and walked out into the main factory area. So the factory where Jeffrey worked was called Bastion Plating Company. And what they did is they made chrome-plated parts for cars. And Jeffrey's specific job was being a machine operator, which meant he basically kept a bunch of these machines running and periodically had to do maintenance on them. And in fact, today he was doing that. He was doing maintenance. Now, in general, this job that Jeffrey did was actually pretty dangerous. The machines they worked on were big industrial machines that often got really, really hot. In fact, it was not uncommon for Jeffrey and his colleagues to come home with burns on their body just from, touching these different machines. But it was just part of the job, and Jeffrey didn't mind it. The pay was pretty good, and overall, the thing he liked the most about his job was just the camaraderie, the other people that worked there. There was about maybe 3 dozen employees who worked at this factory, and it was like a tight-knit family. And so it was like they struggled together. The job was kind of gritty and difficult, but it felt worth it. So on this particular day, Jeffrey walked along this walkway in the main factory area, and as he passed by his colleagues, he said hello. Again, everybody's friends here. And eventually, Jeffrey reached the machine that he was going to be performing maintenance on. And this machine was huge. And the only way for him to actually perform maintenance was to get inside of the machine. But, to Jeffrey and to his colleagues, this type of thing was completely routine. This is not a big deal. And so, as soon as he got to the machine, Jeffrey, with this container he had gotten from the supply room, stepped inside. A few seconds later, one of Jeffrey's colleagues, who was standing on that same walkway Jeffrey had walked across to get to the machine he was working on, this guy hears a loud thud sound coming from over here, over where Jeffrey is. And he turns and he looks into the opening of this machine where Jeffrey had gone, and he sees what appears to be Jeffrey just lying on the ground inside of this machine. And this coworker is just not really understanding what he's seeing. He knows he just heard a thud sound and he's sort of putting it together. And as he's watching, another coworker runs into the machine where Jeffrey is. Clearly they've seen, Jeffrey fall, and so they go in to try to help him. And the guy on the walkway is watching, and this second coworker who rushes into the machine with Jeffrey just suddenly collapses as well, right next to Jeffrey. And then 2 more colleagues come running over, they go into the machine, and they too collapse. All 4 people are just down inside of this machine. And so the coworker who's out on this walkway can tell clearly there's something bad over there. I don't know what's going on. And so they turn, they run out of the factory, and they call 911. When they come back inside to see what's happening in here before first responders have arrived here, this is just seconds later, this coworker comes back to that walkway and he sees now there's 20 other of his coworkers that have sort of begun congregating in this area near this machine. And they're all stumbling around, they're all disoriented, people are vomiting. It's like all hell had broken loose inside of this factory and nobody knew why. And then the first responders become nauseated and disoriented and they're completely down for the count. It's like nobody could be in this factory without losing their senses and collapsing. It would not be until later, when authorities were able to go into this factory with proper protective equipment on, that they could actually examine this machine that Jeffrey had been trying to do maintenance on. And also they examined the container that Jeffrey had brought with him into that machine. When they examined those 2 things, they figured out what happened. So the machine that Jeffrey was performing maintenance on, this big machine, was a huge metal tank that had recently been used to store a chemical called zinc cyanide. And so it was going to be Jeffrey's job to go inside of this tank, literally, and clean the inside of it. And so that container he brought with him from the supply room was a chemical cleaning solution. However, the factory had 2 distinct types of chemical cleaning solutions, and it was very important which one you used depending on what you were cleaning. Jeffrey knew that, he just accidentally grabbed the wrong one. And when this wrong chemical cleaning solution interacted with the residue of the zinc cyanide inside of that tank, it pretty much immediately created a cloud of poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas. This gas immediately caused Jeffrey to pass out, and then each of the subsequent coworkers who rushed into that enclosed space were hit with this gas as well. They too passed out. And as the gas continued to grow and spread, and as more people showed up to see what was going on, the gas began causing other people to pass out and get sick, all the way until, first responders were there. It was like the whole factory was filled with this poison. And so between the factory employees and all the first responders, in total, 39 people were hospitalized from this poisonous gas. And of those 39 people, 5 people died, including Jeffrey, the 3 people who rushed in immediately to try to help him and passed out next to him, as well as 1 additional coworker. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're gonna look at 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices. Now, at the time, these choices were fairly innocuous, but eventually, those choices would completely change not only their lives, but millions of other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say spam, so that every call they get, they think it's spam and they don't answer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On January 17, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of this space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready. And then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can elevate this brand. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words: "Just do it." Dan's client, that small business, was Nike. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios called Redacted: Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do. And so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, "Is this okay?" And she kind of looked back and smiled like, "I get it, it's fine, we can eat here." So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, "Hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, "Sure, go ahead." And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't, and so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, "What's going on?" Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, "What's going on here?" He's looking at his date like, "Did I miss something?" Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, "You're an ugly pig." And at this, Chris is like, "I can't just sit here." And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, "Hey man, get up," like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake, because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date, and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point, and he kept apologizing to his date, and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there, and so they left the McDonald's, and they both, went to their respective homes. And Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good. But it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not gonna get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. He truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. Literally they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States in 1925, the country was in the middle of prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-O-Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. He had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes to the door, and his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door, and it's not friends, it's two police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail, and also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars. which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published. And so that's exactly what Ted began doing. And the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from the pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work, they're like, this is great. And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name, kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth, and then after he graduated, he just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name, a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure you know him much better by his pen name, which is Dr. Seuss. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.